Welcome everyone to our panel on budgeting for the unknown. My name is Bridget Clay, Head of Programmes for School Leadership here at TeachFirst, and it's great to have you all here and to be chairing this panel. So before I introduce the panellists, I just wanted to let you all know that this is being recorded so we can share this with future audiences and people who are unable to join us live today. We know that schools are at the heart of our response to COVID-19, both at the moment and in the long term. And they're already doing all that they can to prepare the next generation for these challenges and working hard to build a fair education for all. And we really want to help. So these panels are focused on how we can support leaders in schools, plan and prepare for future terms. None of us can predict what that's going to look like, but it's great to have people here to discuss these themes around budgeting for the unknown that can support schools. Many schools will have new financial and staffing challenges once pupils return, some of which we know about, some of which we've had very recent updates on, and a lot that we still don't know. So we want to consider how schools can preempt and plan for this in the autumn and potentially adapt ways of working in this more volatile and changing environment. And we really want to hear your thoughts on this. So you can ask questions in the Q&A function, and you can share and tweet your thoughts using the hashtag #FutureTermsPanel. So now to introduce the panel, we have Kim Shubrook, who's an achievement partner here at TeachFirst. Hi, Kim.
Hi, Bridget.
We've got Ed Vainker, who's executive principal at Reach Academy Felton. Hi, Ed.
No.
Jonathan Simons, director and head of the education practice for Public First.
Hello.
And Natalie Perera, Executive Director of the Education Policy Institute. And thanks for joining, Natalie.
Hiya.
So full bios are available on our webpage, and we're now going to hand over to each panellist for a kind of 5-minute introduction and summary of their views on this topic, and then we will open up for your questions. So I'm going to start with Kim. Thank you, and over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I just very briefly entered teaching after being in a finance background. I was a career changer and have been in education now for over 20 years, and I am now an achievement partner for our Leading Together programme at TeachFirst. I think in the current situation, budgeting is going to be very difficult. Budgeting is never an exact science. And we can all budget for the things that we've used and known of in the previous years, and we add a certain percentage to that and move forward. But actually, in these times with lots and lots of shall we say economic debt being built up, and the future looking quite uncertain, if I asked myself, what would I do if I was still head in a school? So what I would do in the short term is actually I would do a plan for a recovery to bridge from where we are now to where we might get to at Christmas. And that would be within the whole holistic budget of a school improvement, because we mustn't forget that whilst we are in this situation, we are still needing to improve what we do in our schools for our children's outcomes. So, interestingly enough, I have been doing some work with one of my schools around this, and they have been working very hard on creating their aspiration for what they want that to look like for their children come September. And they are starting to put together a plan, which obviously will need costing. I also think that the areas around quality of education, premises, including health and safety, safeguarding, etc., your staff, HR, will need to be looked at for a number of different reasons. And I think within that, I can see some HR issues that may need to be dealt with, lots and lots of relationship issues coming through on the HR side. And then with the children, looking at how you can support the children who have had, some have come back to school or will come back to school that have had really positive experiences at home. Some will come back to school that have not had very positive experiences whilst they've been at home. Some children would have learned quite a bit at home. Some children, unfortunately, haven't been able to access learning at home. And we need to look at how we can facilitate the well-being of those children, because it will be strange. They've all got out of routines. And how we can accommodate and build that in to form a bridge between now and maybe Christmas. And because we don't know what's happening, I would then look at maybe a plan of a medium-term plan to come in or run alongside between September and after Christmas. And then whether we will all be back to normal, continue to budget in the normal way, but with an interesting slant. A lot of my schools that I'm working with have said that this situation has actually given them some really positive opportunities, and they are talking about taking some of those positive opportunities and actually putting them into their curriculum moving forward.
Thanks, Kim. Ed, I'm going to pass over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, my name's Ed Vainker and I run a school in Feltham, near Heathrow. And I think my big reflection on this is that I'm surprised in general about how much certainty there is at the moment, about how confidently people are giving opinions about what is going to happen and what schools shouldn't do. It seems to me that there's a huge amount that is uncertain. And I think that what we're planning to do across our school and including in the budget is wait and see and be really curious about how things start. It seems that the key priority for us is getting all of our pupils back into school, and I think there's a real gap there. So in the borough that I serve, in Feltham, in the west of Hounslow, roughly half of pupils in prioritised year groups have returned to school. In the east of the borough, in Chiswick and Kew, which is a little bit more affluent, that figure is more like 90%. And there's a huge piece of work for us to do to make sure that our pupils return. And then, I think so much progress has been made in schools in the UK in recent years in making sure that what's happening in the classroom is really effective. And I think that's the first thing that needs to be prioritised. So setting up teachers and resourcing them to be able to teach well. And then I think keeping powder dry. So keeping resource available to see and to be curious about what the impact of this has been. To Kim's point, I think it's very unpredictable who has had the more difficult experiences. I think we are seeing significant impact in families around anxiety and stress driven by isolation and driven by the financial impact of all of this. And I think that will need resource to support it. And we're talking to partners that we have, like Place to Be, and asking them how they might be able to flex their offer to perhaps do less intensive work with more people. And we're doing that with a number of our kind of partners. I think my instinct is to focus on the core business and to retain maximum flexibility, because hopefully around November, December, when things feel a little bit more normal, then it will be possible to identify where are the places where more resources needed. We're really concerned about our income generation. So we've taken a massive hit on lettings. We bring in usually about 120,000 a year letting our building, and obviously since March we haven't had any income from that. We're slowly starting from the 5th of July to bring some of our partners back, and we're trying to be flexible with the costs and with rent and with the arrangements to give them the maximum chance to return. And similarly with our wraparound care, that's another place where we bring in significant income, and there's a huge amount of uncertainty there, especially if the guidance does say primary pupils need to stay in bubbles. What that means for the wraparound care that we offer, which is incredibly important to our parents, but also really helpful to us financially, is another area of uncertainty and makes this process more difficult. But I think my sort of starting point is, And the third area of uncertainty is that we've handed out 400 computers to families, and I'm very hopeful that they will return in good nick, but given that I sort of pour tea and anything over mine every third day, I'm a little bit nervous. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but my starting point, and I'm interested in this discussion, my starting point will be to focus on the very core and to retain maximum flexibility as things start to hopefully return to normal.
Okay, lovely. So yeah, I completely echo some of what Ed and Kim have said already. I think that while we are facing lots of unknowns over the coming months and maybe longer, there are things that we do know and that we can start to plan for. So even before the pandemic, we knew that many schools were already facing financial pressures. And EPI's work has shown that the proportion of local authority secondary schools in deficit has almost doubled since 2010 and now stands at almost a third. We don't have comparable data for academies, but we do know that around half of secondary academies spend more each year than their income. But this isn't the case for all schools. Across all local authority schools, there's almost £1.8 billion in surplus balances. And while we're not advocating for those balances to be clawed back in any way, it does indicate that not all schools are facing the same degree of financial pressure. And we also know, and again, Ed just spoke about this too, that when schools reopen fully, pupils will almost inevitably need extra support. And that will, of course, vary from pupil to pupil, but we can't expect all children to come back and to pick up immediately where they left off. So whether it's academic catch-up or pastoral and wellbeing support, there is likely to be an extra cost to schools. Now, the government has allocated £80 per pupil for this. This is the 650 million they announced that would go to schools from September. But some of that money will need to be used to contribute to the cost of tutoring if schools choose to buy into the new national tutoring programme. So for an average secondary school, the money left over might just pay for a new teacher or pastoral worker, but probably not both. And for a one-form entry primary, the money is probably not enough to pay even for a part-time post. Another challenge that schools need to plan for is inclusion. And again, the other speakers have alluded to this, that some children may struggle for lots of reasons to readjust to school. And so exclusion, even temporarily, must be the absolute last resort. We know that the most vulnerable kids are the ones most likely to be excluded. So those from poor families, Black kids, those with SEND, and those who are looked after by the state. And we really cannot afford for those pupils to miss out on yet more school. So school leaders need to plan now for how they will avoid this. And we may also know that blended learning may need to continue for some time if there's a second wave of the pandemic, and indeed for pupils who need to continue to shield for various reasons. So schools will need to have plans for how they can continue to enable home learning and not just switch everything off come September. And the same applies to staffing. Schools will need to plan for staff who are shielding or who need to self-isolate for a period of time and put contingency measures in place. And this is likely to have an impact on supply budgets, for example. So heads may need to consider increasing that budget temporarily. And finally, this is where governors and trustees can really come to the fore and support schools and heads. And head teachers should lean on them to help with risk management and budgeting. And governors should also be steering heads to spend money in evidence-based ways and even facilitating schools to work together to increase spending power. So in summary, yes, there are lots that we don't know, but there are also lots of things that we can anticipate and plan for. And I think that school leaders are generally very good at doing this, even outside of a pandemic scenario.
Thanks, Natalie. Jonathan, we're going to try again. Fingers crossed. Over to you.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, loud and clear. It's great.
Wonderful. Apologies for that before. So I think I would make a couple of points really further to what's been said, which I entirely agree with. I think it is worth noting that of all the sectors of the education system, purely from a financial perspective, state schools have been impacted the least. So universities have taken a huge financial hit and will continue to do so. And it is not beyond the bounds of possibility that several universities effectively go bust or have to merge over the next year or so. Similarly, further education colleges have taken a huge financial hit, and early years providers have taken a huge financial hit. State-funded maintained schools and academies have continued to be funded throughout this entire period of time, regardless of the fact that they've not been open to every single child. And certainly I know from some head teachers, although of course some head teachers have been spending a huge amount of additional money to cope with the breaks in the DFE support, a lot of other head teachers are actually doing financially better than they would have otherwise been because they've made significant savings during this process. So the starting point, it is worth noting from a central government point of view, the view is that state schools are relatively well placed to bounce back from this, more so than other areas of the
Okay, well, hopefully I'm going to, there may be a chance to come back, and certainly in questions there'll be opportunities to hear what your next points were going to be. So I'm going to start opening up to questions, and people will be using the Q&A function. And to kind of get us started, a really helpful overview from most, if not all, our panelists there, so thank you. Ed, you mentioned focusing on core business, on core business, and kind of keeping the powder dry to wait and see what schools are facing, as it is a very moving picture. Although we've also heard other examples of things that are likely to have increased costs, like supply costs, for example. What, if anything, can schools stop doing or deprioritise in order to kind of focus on that core business and keep some resources flexibly?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, we in terms of financially, we subsidise quite significantly things like residential trips, and we use significant proportions of our kind of pupil premium funding for those sorts of enrichment and flexible things that we are not planning for the autumn term. We intend to, we still aspire to doing those. We think those experiences are really important, and indeed all the more so in the current climate. But I think there is some flexibility there. I think Jonathan's right when he says that there are parts of the schools' budgets that have been saved, I guess, in this period. Although, as I mentioned, schools that generate additional income beyond their gag, often that would have been significantly disrupted. I think what I'm particularly thinking about is the additional funding that Natalie was mentioning, and the kind of activities that are currently being discussed. Things like, we're not talking about summer schools, but things like summer schools. Those feel to me to be things to do when you have a very, very clear picture and understanding of exactly what the needs of your cohort are. And I just don't think that on the whole, we as a system understand exactly what our young people have experienced and what exactly is going to be the thing that's going to help them. And so, we're going to be conservative in our spending on things, in all the areas that are discretionary. Although it's important to say, for schools that there isn't a huge amount that's discretionary. Once you've got your staff in post, your flexibility is not massive. But with the flexibility that we have, we're going to be really conservative. We're going to try and keep money in the bank so that as the year progresses, and we can think about the needs of our year 13 students, our year 11 students, and then our most vulnerable students, and particularly think about what resource we can provide to signpost to our families the support that's available, especially to those families for whom the change in circumstances is something very new. You know, we've had families who hadn't ever had to apply for universal credit, who are going to a food bank for the first time, and negotiating that when that's not something that you have experience of is particularly challenging. And often that kind of relational referral that comes from a trusted person in a school, for example, is really important there.
Thank you, that's really interesting. Kim, Natalie, would you like to add anything to that question?
No. No, I think it is all around, as Ed said, around being in some respects conservative, but in the short term looking at what you're going, and I know you don't know this until September probably, but there's children that have been identified in some of the schools that I've been talking to that have children in the school at the moment, and these children have kind of come on leaps and bounds, and they have just thrived in a smaller environment. Someone today was talking about an EYFS who had 2 bubbles, and they'd split 2 bubbles, one with most of their speech and language children in, and the other children were in the other bubble, and the value and the positive learning curve that's come out of that bubble with the children of speech and language issues has been very, very profound. And it is, again, I touched on it earlier, we're going to get children coming back who, as teachers, we've probably known them in the class, we know what they're capable of, and then all of a sudden they come back and they have again flourished and grown, doing what they've been doing at home. And it's just knowing your context, knowing your children, and within all of that mix as well is the transition, because children will come back into school probably not in the year group that they left. So there's a question there around what the transition's going to look like for those children.
Absolutely. Natalie, you were talking about a number of things that schools and leaders can plan for. This is a question from an attendee. Any advice on looking ahead where there's a lack of confidence in allocations and where new money may be coming from? What does that planning look like in this uncertainty?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think one of the things that we've always done in the trust where I'm a director is to look at our pupil numbers and our pupil forecast. That's your sort of core, that allows you to do your core planning, and know that it's unlikely that per pupil allocations will move much beyond that. So I think even with uncertainty about the wider financial picture, it's very unlikely from year to year that your core school funding will dip significantly unless you've got a significant dip in your pupil numbers. And the minimum funding guarantee provides some kind of protection from year to year. Clearly, where we do see pressures are related to things like the removal of the Year 7 catch-up premium, which was unexpected and unforeseen. We know that, or the plan was that teacher pay and starting salary in particular would be increased from this year. So I think, again, so that there are things where we know that the income is likely to be certain, and if we follow policy announcements, we can see where there may likely be pressures building up. But again, as the catch-up programme has shown, there may also be things that are unforeseen. But I think if you can approach it from what do we know, what's likely to stay stable, and what are the things that what are the parameters that could be moved, then that could be helpful.
That's great, thank you. And we've touched on the potential likelihood of staff absence and what that might mean for supply budgets and so on. Kim, I'm going to start with you on this one. Can you foresee schools spending additional funds on staff CPD as they're returning to this, or will return in September to this more complex picture? What do you think would make the biggest difference?
I think this could give schools, in certain circumstances, an ideal kind of opportunity to actually use some CPD to upskill the teachers on various needs that children may present at this moment in time, such as attachment disorder, and many others that might come through the door. And I think it is an opportunity if it's something that your teachers do need some kind of training on and some skill on to accommodate those children in their classes, then I think that would be a great opportunity to use as a CPD piece of work. Great.
And Ed, building on that, both around CPD, but I suppose also considering potential line management and other practices in terms of supporting staff, what are your kind of reflections on that?
I mean, I think it's an obvious point, and one that's been made a lot recently, but I think the experience of being able to do more online does open up huge opportunities for schools. And I think particularly the high quality access to CPD, things like Research Ed at Home and those sorts of things, and some really great kind of provision from, a range of providers, I think does challenge the assumption that spending days out on courses and stuff is the right way to go. And I think that there is opportunity there in the professional development market. I do also think there's an opportunity in the cover market as well, in the cover space as well. I think schools have been struck by students' ability to learn to study remotely, and I think platforms like Oak and others can help schools and can give schools some options when it comes to supply and when it comes to cover. And I think, also, I think there is a recognition that subject to the rules and subject to the guidance around bubble pods and all this kind of stuff, I think there is the potential to be a bit more flexible with group size, and to have, pupils accessing material content in different ways, perhaps having an exposition that is delivered on the computer and then supported in different kind of groups. So we're definitely thinking about that. And I think a number of schools are, and actually I think quite a lot of schools have been doing that for a while to kind of manage both the financial impact of cover, but also the practical impact on learning and so on, and the kind of consequent perhaps impact on behavior in classrooms. So I can see that continuing. I think the difficulty at the moment is not knowing exactly what the guidance is going to be, and the ability to teach a group in a group of 60 or a group of 90 at the moment seems like that's unlikely to be the case for September. But in the longer term, I do think there's an opportunity there.
Great. And Kim, building on your point about opportunity for staff to develop more, staff could have their own additional needs potentially in responding to this, and we've all had personal and professional challenges, I'm sure, and will continue to do so. How can we support staff and plan to support staff?
I think some of the ways could be, from an adult point of view, is if you have SLT meetings, you could make a thing that you will, before you start on the work, you have this trust, hopefully amongst your team, where you are inquiring how everybody is and what have they done what's gone really well for them this week, what hasn't, and that could be shared with a personal point of view or a professional point of view, depending on how comfortable everybody was in the team. So that's kind of one idea. I think something else is for the SLT to be aware of each other, so they are there to support each other, and if there's any kind of real issues, then that needs to be fed to somebody who can support, say the head teacher maybe. And and then it's also from the SLT's point of view looking out for the rest of the staff. So they need to model those kinds of support and what that might look like in their school, so that the other staff also know that they feel supported. I think there's a lot of ways that staff you could, you know, you could deliver, let people know where these things are. It's all about communication, and to think about how you as an SLT could communicate that down to your staff, that the support is there and these are the avenues. And one of the schools I was working with this week actually suggested that they had worry boxes for the children, and it was something that they'd identified that they wanted to kind of kind of introduce and make it more aware, the children more aware it was there, but also the idea of that maybe having one for the adults as well. So yeah, there's lots of things that we can do, but again, my worry also is around, whilst the SLT and the head is supporting everybody else, who's supporting the head? So there's got to be, I think, from a governance point of view, some form of realisation of that, and a more of awareness of what they can do to support the head, because there are a number of heads out there that are really highly stressed,
of course,
over this situation, and you know, I've spoken to a couple this week and last week before, and they have been incredibly stressed out over what is going on and what is expected of them and the unknown.
Absolutely. And there's recruitment and retention has been a live topic for a while, and that's going to be very, presumably this will have an impact on that. Natalie, do you think we're going to see a long-term financial impact on schools that will then affect staff recruitment and retention, and how do you think those kind of interrelate?
It's really difficult to say. As Jonathan and I have both indicated, the financial position of schools is quite complex. Yes, schools are more generously funded and protected than other phases of education. And yes, funding is still higher than it was back in the early 2000s. But we know that in recent years, actually, there's been a real terms decrease in funding. So what would the longer term picture look like? I think on teacher recruitment and retention, we're heading into what looks to be a recession, and we've seen from today's figures that entry numbers into ITT are up quite significantly, which is the usual trend we see as we approach and during a recession. So I think we will have so the recruitment challenge that schools were facing this time last year looks like it could be easing off. At the same time, the challenge will be to keep those teachers post recession, and hopefully once the economy and public spending picks up again. So I think there is still a challenge there for teacher recruitment and retention specifically. And I think the longer term outlook for schools is probably that they shouldn't expect a great deal more, given they've been relatively protected to date. And even though we don't think the £1 billion announced last week goes far enough, it will still be seen as an extra investment in schools.
Thank you. And you mentioned higher applications, kind of joining the profession. We know that teachfirst trainee placements have dropped, and it's a reflection of the greater challenges that schools are facing, or potentially something else. So how can we ensure that schools still feel they have the capacity to support trainees and early career teachers? I'm going to pass this over to Ed. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky. I think the uncertainty is a factor, and I think for us, you know, we've we've been really focused on providing as much consistency as possible for our pupils, and so particularly in primary, that mitigates against taking trainees because you're likely to be splitting classes and so on. So I think there's a kind of a moral sort of in the interest of the team kind of argument here, that kind of schools need to recognize that it's our collective responsibility to bring people into the profession, and I think need to kind of make that commitment to take trainees, whether it's from Teach First, but also I think importantly, I know that universities are finding it very difficult to find placements for PGCE students, and I think we definitely don't want trainees having an experience where they're not able to get into schools and they're not able to spend time in the classroom before they start. So I think there's a kind of a collective endeavour, and I think there needs a bit of a call to action there to kind of engage schools in that work, because ultimately, as Natalie has said, it's in our interest to make sure that we can bring those people into the profession and keep them there. And one of the best ways of doing that is for them to be successful quickly and to become more effective. So I'm very, very keen to support that, while acknowledging that the core business of a school is to support their pupils. And this is an added layer of complexity at a time when, at a time of uncertainty. And while there is that uncertainty, it's difficult for schools to say, I think I can support trainees, I think I can support training and new teachers.
Thank you. Jonathan, welcome back. I'm going to pose a question to you, but then please do kind of add to your comments that you weren't able to finish earlier. So this is a question from an attendee who asks, the claim form for the additional costs came out yesterday with new guidance. It's likely that they'll be continued to have additional costs, but with no further support. Do you think that the ESFA will look better on reducing reserves in the future years as schools navigate this challenge?
Yes, apologies again. Can you hear me better now?
Very well, thank you.
Good. So sorry, just to clarify the question, as in, do they think the ESFA should look more positively on reducing reserves?
Yeah, so is it likely that they will, and the suggestion being that they should do, given that there will likely be additional costs but no further support?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So I think the fairly hard-hearted view from central government, as I was saying, is that schools have been relatively better coming through this than other areas of the education system, and though many have incurred additional costs, many haven't. I think DfE has been overly stingy in the way in which they covered their additional costs form, and actually saying that you can only do so if you're essentially breaking even or losing money anyway is ridiculously stingy. Having said that, I think reserves have to be the first port of call for this, and certainly if I were a school or a trust and I had reserves, I'd be thinking about using them precisely for this. The question, as ever, is distinguishing between is reserves for what you can call capital investment, or things that are genuinely going to be repeatable, and reserves to cover cover recurring costs. So if you think that substantially, because of shielding, you're going to need one additional member of staff, FTE, that is not a good use of your reserves, because you need to pay for that teacher for the following however many years. On the other hand, if you think that you need additional, for example, broadband internet, so that you don't fall out at crucial points, that is a good use of reserves. If you think that you need additional learning resources that can be used offline, that's a good use of reserves. So I think if I were a trustee now, or I were a head teacher or a business manager, I'd be thinking very hard about how I use those, precisely because this is the rainy day for which reserves are put away.
Great, thank you. And did you want to add anything from when you...
No, I've disrupted it enough, so let's just carry on.
Right. So this is a question from Emily Chapman on Twitter. She asks, is COVID-19 going to result in a wave goodbye to the planned teacher salary increases, which you mentioned, Natalie? Should we as teaching be accepting a pay rise when the country is entering in recession, or does the situation justify them even more? And I'm going to open this up to whoever wants to jump in with a view on that one. Which results in a stunned silence.
I think people are hedging their bets a bit, aren't they? Because I don't know, I don't feel confident enough saying whether those planned pay rises will go ahead or not. Jonathan might have more insight. But I think it would be very very difficult and very uncomfortable for the government to claw back on those commitments. But I think it will be one of the things that they'll be considering during the forthcoming spending round.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think to the extent that the government's made a big commitment to them and to the sort of £30,000 starting salary, if it's not legally impossible, it's certainly politically impossible to row back on that. And I think one of the things that will come out of this, it's very easy to talk about moments in time where everything changes, but I do think that this is one, and I suspect the general theory of the state and the theory of public spending that says we should minimize waste, maximize efficiency, only run things on a very lean, just-in-time basis, I think will go. And I think part of that also means that only having the exact number of teachers we need on the exact salary that we need to get just about as many people in and no further probably will go. And I suspect that not least the Parliamentary Conservative Party appear to now be quite keen on additional spending. It's hard to think of many better calls of additional spending than on additional public service wages. So nurses and allied health professionals are probably right at the front of the queue. I can't see any way in which they don't get a significant pay bump, but I think teachers are probably pretty close behind. I don't think the same applies to teaching assistants and other support staff, incidentally. I think that they will continue to be borne down on quite tightly, but I suspect teachers will certainly get the raises that have been promised to them and potentially even more.
Great, thank you both. Ed, you touched on how there's been a real variety in how the sort of challenges that pupils have faced during this, and it may not have been what we could have predicted. It's likely that we'll see a real economic impact on the families that you're working with, and potential increase in pupil premium eligible students. How do you think that might impact schools and your work?
I think that I think the impact of stress and the challenges to relationships that come with anxiety around providing for your family. 1 in 4 of our families report being concerned about paying for food in the next 6 weeks. And I think that's incredibly challenging. And I think there just will be an impact of that on our young people. And to mitigate that, we intend to work very hard to support our families to mitigate, their concerns and to signpost support and to offer support where we can. And I think we're really interested. I mean, we're right next to Heathrow. We're really interested in what the strategy is to support people back into work, because we're expecting huge numbers of people to lose their jobs, and we'll be very keen to be involved in that. It's interesting, the work that we've done in the past around this hasn't yielded great results. We were very keen to support parents to be able to access 30 hours, and we helped groups of parents back into work, and it was pretty not very good work, frankly. It was shift work, it was at the airport, it was very difficult for them to balance with childcare, and actually it had quite a negative impact. And I think other things that we've done around helping supporting our teachers, supporting parents to train as teaching assistants and so on, haven't actually yielded the kind of jobs and the kind of progress that we wanted. So I think we need a kind of intelligent strategy there for us. I think it's important to say, that there is a bottom line of increasing eligibility for pupil premium, and that is a primary pupil is where, one extra pupil premium pupil is worth £1,300 for the next 6 years. And we are checking the eligibility of our whole cohort of pupils twice a week at the moment, and we're seeing our pupil premium cohort increase, and we're doing that because we want to support them, but also because we want to make sure we can access the better part of £8,000 over the next 6 years. And I do think that's important, because people's circumstances are changing, and they're changing quickly, and I think schools need to be in touch with their families or have mechanisms where they can check, because if a family loses their job and they're eligible for a month, say, and a school isn't aware of it and it isn't reported, then they won't become eligible for the pupil premium in the longer term. So we've always had a kind of a monthly check, but we're now up to twice weekly, which probably Catherine, who leads that work, thinks is excessive, but I'm refusing to compromise.
Thanks, Ed. Jonathan, you mentioned how early years has been kind of particularly hit by this, and we know that quality early years learning is essential to reducing the education attainment gap. How can we address this issue where that's so critical to fair education for all, and they're under amongst immense strain?
Yeah, I do think this is one of the areas that's been underplayed in the response to the crisis. So, you know, for better or worse, a lot of money has been spent on helping schools recover. A decent amount of money has been advanced to higher education. A decent amount of money has been advanced to employers to support apprentices and put apprenticeships on pause. Colleges haven't had that much, and of course got taken out allegedly of the £1 billion scheme at the last minute. But early years has also had, as far as I can see, almost nothing. And a lot of early years provision runs on very, very small margins. And the fact that they haven't had kids in for 3 or 4 months puts a lot of them at risk. And all of my answers are sort of just give more to Ed to do more, basically about everything. And this is definitely one of them. I think what Reach does with sort of early years and wraparound and link between early years and school is exactly the right answer. And, you know, obviously there's physical estate issues, but if I were doing things as government, number one, I'd want to start building a lot of stuff pretty quickly as an investment and as a stimulus. I'd want to get construction going. And one of the big things I'd look to be building is I'd look to be building new primary schools, and I'd look to be building early years provision around it, and having as much as possible co-located with a teacher or teacher equivalent, graduate equivalent person leading it, with a pretty seamless integration between the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds, and then going into reception. All the evidence says that that's one of the best things that can happen. And I've seen phenomenal impacts of it anecdotally when I've gone and seen, including in Feltham, but at other places. And we can't expect the current very, very hodgepodge provision of early years, both on the supply side and the demand side, to be the effective way in which we deliver early years education. We just have to change it. We have to sort it out. And we should take the opportunity now to do that.
Great. So Ed, good news. Jonathan thinks you should have more funding. Do you want to give any more context to that for our listeners?
Yeah. I mean, I just think this is the. I mean, I'm less plugged into the university sector, and I understand they're in crisis. But for me, this is the key bit of this, and it touches on so much, because once that provision goes, once those nurseries, those PVIs go bust, like what happens then when jobs arrive? The childcare isn't available. It's harder for people to return to work. That has a particular effect on women returning to work. It has a particular effect on the most vulnerable returning to work, and that workforce, you know, go and do other things. I mean, I think there needs to be there needs to be real thought put into this. The other problem is it's not going to be easy to turn the tap back on in terms of parents returning their children to nursery in the same way, hopefully, that it will be to school. And I would urge government to fund local authorities to fund their PVIs for September to December based on the numbers they had a year ago, so that they can have some time to bring those 3-year-olds back and the vulnerable 2-year-olds back, if necessary, doing the outreach that they might need to do that, to push health services to release the data about where those kids live, what their postcodes are, because we know that, but it's very difficult for education providers to find those 3-year-olds, and it's a little bit like kind of needle in a haystack stuff. But if we don't do it, it's going to have a really negative effect on those businesses. And we already have, you know, very, very often head teachers that I speak to will report that one of the most stressful things they face is reception cohorts with pupils with acute SEN. That is a huge barrier to delivering an effective education to the children in reception, and often in primary schools sucks massive senior leadership time that then can't be devoted to improving the quality of education. If 10%, 15%, 20% fewer kids are accessing nursery provision next year, in 2 years we're going to be storing up for ourselves that problem on steroids. And I think there needs to be action now, and it's a problem, I think, that the voices that we hear in the media about this, there doesn't feel like there's a strong voice pushing and defending early years, and I think that's something that's really needed.
Thank you. Natalie, you mentioned the kind of role of governors and trustees and sort of steering spend to be focused on evidence-based strategies and potentially collaborating with other schools. Do you have any advice or suggestions for how governors and trustees who are potentially listening to this can sort of prepare on what they should be thinking about now with that in mind?
Yeah, so I guess it's all of the things that we've talked about already, particularly Ed and Kim, who are working on the front line, or who are indeed closer to the front line. So what are the things that we know? You know, they know, trustees and governors and head teachers know their pupil cohort better than central government, better than anyone on this panel. And so what are the things that they expect their pupils to need either now or come September? What do they know about their staff and how medically vulnerable they are? What do they know about the kind of teacher turnover they have in a normal year? And what assumptions can we make about how that might vary this year? You know, as Jonathan said, how can we use any surplus funding that we have in order to support the school during this time? And again, and I would reiterate that point that Jonathan made about making sure that they are time limited interventions rather than something like a salary cost, which will require ongoing funding. So taking all of that and thinking about what are the sensible decisions or what's the sensible planning that we can do now? What decisions can we take now? And yeah, I think one of the things that has come out of the pandemic is, and this is anecdotal, but it feels like schools are talking to each other more and working outside of those structural silos that we've seen build over the last 10 years. And I think if we can continue to do that and think about schools more as a community in terms of their role in the community, then I think that's an important lesson we can take away. I just want to come back to the early years point briefly, and again, completely agree with the sentiment of what Ed and Jonathan were saying. But I think there needs to be two really important priorities for government. The first is absolutely how do we support early years providers, particularly PVI providers, to get back on their feet after the pandemic. They've been badly hit and they've had no, apart from the furlough scheme, had no support from government at all, and certainly not in the same way that schools has. But even COVID aside, the early years is a Cinderella part of the education provision. And in the last few years, all of the subsidies have gone towards working parents and people on higher incomes, as opposed to more vulnerable children who need earlier intervention and earlier education. And if we continue to fund early years at the current rates and not increase early years funding, we risk not being able to improve the quality and the qualifications that we need in order to secure longer term outcomes. And we know from fairly recent evidence in the United States that actually when you look at funding, if you start early, if you increase funding early on, and then you keep that funding increase sustained throughout school, you have better long-term impacts, not just in academic outcomes, but in incarceration rates and employment rates as well.
Thank you. Kim, I'm going to come to you with the final question. Building on what Natalie mentioned there around the kind of opportunity for collaboration and the collaboration that we've seen, we've had a few questions about whether this is an opportunity for better school-to-school collaboration. And I wonder what your views were on this and what that might look like.
Again, I think this is developing what Natalie said just now is an opportunity more than a negative. And I know that some schools have reached out to other schools that they may not have reached out to before. There's been a sense of, in some areas, a sense of community, and we are in this together. And that has broken down some of those barriers of these silos that Natalie referred to earlier on. So I think it has helped to develop that communication and collaboration more in some areas than others. But I do think it's that common thread that pulls everybody together, isn't it? We're all in this together. We're all dealing with this issue. And I think sometimes when that happens, it does kind of knock the walls down that people tend to build around them, and allows that kind of sharing of information, of experience, of practice. And I think, you know, some heads that I've spoken to have really appreciated that and have kind of felt that sense of real collaboration amongst them. So I think it's an opportunity, and I think for general collaboration, it has always been difficult to encourage schools to collaborate for many different reasons. And I just think if we could maybe look at collaboration and change mindsets in a different way, this may have been a negative, but has a positive outcome from it. Yeah.
Thanks. And what a note to end on. I feel like we've explored some kind of strategies and considerations for the challenges, but we've also heard a number of opportunities in this conversation, which is really great. And this will be recorded and shared with others, but I'd encourage you to kind of continue the conversation using our hashtag Future Terms Panel. And we'll be back next Thursday at the same time with our final panel of the series. Thank you so much, Ed, Kim, Natalie, Jonathan, for your time and your contributions. It's been really powerful and given lots of food for thought, and I've noted lots down that I'm going to be mulling over. So thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.